Strange happenings. Along the wall to your left, as you enter the Stahlbaum's living room, there is a tall fronted cabinet in which the children keep all the lovely presents they receive each year. Louise was still a very small child when her father had this cabinet made by a skillful craftsman, who fitted it out with such sparkling panes of glass and made the whole thing so cleverly that the contents looked almost brighter and more beautiful than when you held them in your hands. On the top shelf, beyond the reach of Marie and Fritz, were the products of Godfather Drosselmeyer's skill. The next shelf down held the picture books. As for the two lowest shelves, Marie and Fritz were allowed to keep whatever they pleased there. Marie used the bottom shelf as a home for her dolls, while Fritz garrisoned his troops on the one above it. This is just what they did today, for while Fritz was installing his hussars on the higher of the two shelves, Marie pushed Mistress Trude to one side, moved her new doll into the beautifully furnished room, and invited herself to have tea and cakes with her. I've said that in this room was very well furnished, and that's the truth. For my attentive reader Marie, I didn't know whether you, like the little Stahlbaum girl, you remember, of course, that she too was called Marie. I don't know, that is, whether you too have a lovely little flowered sofa, several dear little chairs, a charming tea table, and most especially a spanking clean bed for your lovely dolls to sleep in. All those things were in the corner of the shelf, the walls of which were papered with color pictures. You can imagine that the new doll, whose name, as Marie learned that same evening, was Mistress Clara, found her room extremely comfortable. It was getting late, almost midnight. Godfather Drosselmeyer had left long ago, and still the children couldn't tear themselves away from the glass-fronted cabinet, though their mother had several times urged them to turn in for the night. "It's true," Fritz finally said. "The poor fellows," meaning his hussars, "needed their rest." With that, he retired. But Marie pleaded, "Just a little while longer. Let me stay just a little longer, mother dear. I still have certain things to attend to, and then I'll go right off to bed." Marie was a sensible, well-behaved child, so her mother felt that she could leave her alone with her toys for a while without too much cause for worry. Still, to make sure that Marie wouldn't be so intent on her new dolls and all the other new toys that she'd forget the candles around the cupboard, her mother put them all out, leaving only the lamp which hung from the ceiling in the middle of the room and cast a pleasantly soft light. "Go to bed soon, Marie, or you won't be able to get up tomorrow," said her mother as she went off to her bedroom. As soon as Marie was alone, she did what had been most on her mind, something that she herself didn't know why she couldn't mention to her mother. All the while she had been holding the wounded Nutcracker in her arms, still wrapped in her handkerchief. Now she laid him carefully on the table, unwrapped the handkerchief ever so slowly, and examined his wounds. The Nutcracker was very pale, but he gave Marie a sad, friendly smile that went straight to her heart. "Dear Nutcracker," she said softly, "don't be angry at Brother Fritz for hurting you so. He meant no harm. It's just that the rough soldier's life has made him somewhat hard-hearted. Otherwise, he's not a bad boy, I assure you. But now I'm going to take the very best care of you until you're well and happy again. Your teeth will be put back in and held fast, and Godfather Drosselmeyer will set your shoulders straight. He's good at those things." Marie couldn't finish what she had to say, because the moment she mentioned Godfather Drosselmeyer, friend Nutcracker made a horrible face, and his eyes seemed to send out green sparks. But just as Marie was beginning to be frightened, Nutcracker turned to her with his usual sad smile, and she knew that what had so distorted his face was the light of the lamp flaring up suddenly in the draught. "What a foolish girl I am," she said to herself, "getting scared for no reason, and even imagining that a wooden doll can make faces. But I do love Nutcracker, because he's so funny and good-natured, and I will take the best care of him." With that, she picked Nutcracker up in her arms, went over to the toy cabinet, bent down in front of it, and said to her new doll, "Mistress Clara, I must ask you to give up your bed to our poor Nutcracker and make do with the sofa. After all, you're bursting with health, or you wouldn't have such plump red cheeks, and I hope you realize that very few dolls, even the prettiest, have such nice sofas to sleep on." Mistress Clara looked very distinguished and morose in her Christmas finery, and she didn't say boo. "But why am I making such a fuss?" said Marie, whereupon she pulled out the bed, put Nutcracker in it gently, took a pretty ribbon that she usually wore around her waist, and wrapped it around his injured shoulders, and drew the bedclothes up to his nose. "I won't have him staying with that horrid Clara," she said to herself, and moved the bed with the Nutcracker in it to the shelf above, right next to the pretty little village where Fritz's hussars were quartered for the night. Then she shut the toy cabinet, and she was going to the bedroom when, now pay attention, children, soft whispering and shuffling were heard around about, behind the stove, behind the chairs, behind the cupboards. The tall clock whirled louder and louder, but it didn't strike. Marie looked at it and saw that the big gilded owl perched on top of it had lowered its wings in such a way as to cover the whole clock and was sticking out its ugly cat's head with a crooked beak. The whirring grew louder and louder, and now words could be heard. "Clocks, clocks, whirl softly, do not strike. Mouse King is keen of hearing. Whir, whir, purr, purr. Sing him the old song. Whir, whir, purr, purr. Ring, bell, ring. Ding dong, ding dong. He won't last long." Then the clock whirred 7 times, 12 muffled whir-whirs. Marie shuddered. She was on the point of running away when she saw Godfather Drosselmeyer, who was sitting on the clock instead of the owl. His yellow coat-tails hung down like drooping wings. "Godfather Drosselmeyer," she cried out, "what are you doing up there? Come down and stop frightening me so, you wicked Godfather Drosselmeyer." But then she heard giggling and squeaking all around her, followed by the sound of 1,000 little feet scampering behind the walls, and 1,000 little lights peered out through the cracks in the woodwork. But it wasn't lights. Oh no, it was little sparkling eyes, and Marie saw mice peering out on all sides, squeezing through the chinks. Soon they were scampering all over the room, bigger and bigger bands of them, and in the end they formed ranks, just as Fritz's soldiers did before marching off to war. Marie thought they were funny, since she did not, like some children, have an inborn horror of mice. She would have lost all fear had she not suddenly heard a piercing squeak that sent shivers down her spine. What did she see then? Believe me, dear reader Fritz, I know you're as brave as the wise and fearless Field Marshal Fritz Stahlbaum, but if you had seen what Marie saw then, you'd have run away. I even think you'd have jumped into bed and pulled the covers higher above your ears. But poor Marie couldn't do that because, now listen, dear children, right in front of her feet, sand and lime and crushed stone came gushing out of the floor as though driven by some underground force, and 7 mouse heads with 7 sparkling crowns rose up, squeaking and squealing hideously. Soon the mouse's body, to which the 7 heads were attached, worked itself up through the floor, and this enormous mouse, crowned with 7 diadems, was hailed by the entire army, cheering with 3 loud squeaks. And then the army set itself in motion, hop, hop, trot, trot, heading straight for the toy cabinet, straight for Marie, who was standing next to it. Marie's heart beat so hard with fear and horror that she thought it would jump out of her body and she would die. Then she felt as if her blood were standing still in her veins. Close to fainting, she reeled backwards, and then, crash, the glass pane she had struck with her elbow fell in slivers to the floor. For a moment she felt a stinging pain in her left arm, but suddenly her heart was lighter. She no longer heard the squeaking and hissing. Although she was unable to look, it seemed to her that the mice had been frightened by the noise of the shattering glass and crept back into their holes. But what now? Right behind Marie, strange sounds were heard in the cabinet, and delicate little voices whispering, "Awake, awake, on to the fight this very night, awake, awake." At the same time, there was a delightful sound of bells. "Oh, that's my little music box," cried Marie happily, and she jumped to one side. Then she saw a strange glow inside the toy cabinet. The whole population seemed to be on the move. A number of dolls were running in all directions, thrashing about with their little arms. All at once, the Nutcracker sat up, threw off his blanket, and jumped out of bed with both feet at once, shouting at the top of his lungs. Crack, crack, crack! Ugly, stupid mice! We'll beat them blue and black. We'll squash them all like lice. Crack, crack, crack. With that, he drew his little sword, swung it through the air, and cried, My dear vassals, friends and brothers, will you stand by me in this bitter battle? Instantly, 3 scaramouches, a pantaloon, 4 chimney sweeps, 2 zither players, and a drummer shouted, Yes, your lordship, we will follow you through thick and thin, to death, victory, and battle. Whereupon, imitating the intrepid Nutcracker, they jumped from the upper shelf. It was easy enough for them to jump, as they were fully dressed in silk and wool, and besides, there was nothing much inside them but cotton and sawdust. So they just plumped down like sacks of wool. But poor Nutcracker would certainly have broken his arms and legs, because, just imagine, it was nearly 2 feet from the shelf where he had been standing to the lowest one, and his body was as brittle as if it had been made of linden wood. Yes, Nutcracker would have undoubtedly broken his arms and legs if, just as he leaped, Mistress Clara hadn't jumped up from the sofa and caught the hero, drawn sword and all, in her arms. Ah, my dear sweet Clara, cried Marie through her tears, how unkind I was to you. I'm sure you were perfectly willing to give friend Nutcracker your bed. But Mistress Clara, pressing the young hero to her silken bosom, said, Oh, my lord, I beseech you, sick and wounded as you are, go not into perilous battle. See how your brave vassals are mustering their forces, eager for the fray and confident of victory. Sarmucci, Pantaloon, Chimney Sweep, Zither Player, and Drummer are already below, and the banner bearers here on my shelf are already on the move. I entreat you, my lord, to rest in my arms, or to look down upon your victory from the brim of my plumed hat. So spoke Clara, but Nutcracker was so resistive and flailed about so with his legs that Mistress Clara had to put him down on the floor. He knelt graciously and whispered, My lady, the favor you have shown me will be ever present in my mind on the battlefield. Clara bent low, took hold of his arms, lifted him gently, quickly undid her spangled girdle, and tried to put it around his shoulders, but he took 2 steps back, laid his hand on his breast, and said solemnly, Dear lady, do not waste this mark of favor upon me, for he stopped and gave a deep sigh, quickly tore from his shoulders the ribbon Marie had tied around him, pressed it to his lips, put it on as a token, and bravely brandishing his bare sword, jumped as nimbly as a bird over the ledge of the cabinet to the floor. You have surely observed, dear reader, that Nutcracker, even before coming fully to life, had been well aware of Marie's love and regard for him. Of course, it was only because he had become so fond of Marie that he hadn't wanted to accept Mistress Clara's ribbons, shiny and pretty as it was. Faithful Nutcracker preferred to wear Marie's simpler little ribbon. But what's going to happen now? The moment Nutcracker jumped, the squeaking and squealing started in again. Under the big table, the murderous hordes of mice came to a halt, and over them all towered the hideous mouse with 7 heads. What will happen now? The battle. Trusty vassal drummer, cried Nutcracker in a loud voice, sound the advance. Whereupon the drummer began to ply his drumsticks so skillfully that the windows of the toy cabinet rattled and resounded. A cracking and clattering were heard from inside, and Marie saw the lids of all the boxes where Fritz's army was quartered for the night burst open. Soldiers climbed out and jumped to the bottom shelf, where they formed ranks. Nutcracker ran back and forth, shouting words of encouragement to the troops. Why doesn't that dog of a trumpeter bestir himself? He cried angrily. Then, turning to Pantaloon, whose long chin was wobbling badly, and who had turned deathly pale, Nutcracker said gravely, General, I know how brave and experienced you are. What's needed here is a quick eye and the ability to take prompt action. I put you in command of our cavalry and artillery. You won't need a horse. You gallop very nicely on those long legs of yours. Ply your trade. Pantaloon put his long, bony fingers in his mouth and blared as piercingly as 100 trumpets. A neighing and stamping were heard in the cabinet. Fritz's dragons and cursors, and most particularly his shiny new hussars, came marching out and halted on the floor down below. With banners flying and bands playing, regiment after regiment marched past Nutcracker and massed in the middle of the room. Fritz's artillery came clanking past. A few moments later, the guns were going boom, boom. Marie saw sugar balls landing in the serried ranks of the mice, who were spattered with white powder, which made them feel very sheepish. But the worst damage was done by a battery of heavy guns set up on Mama's footstool, which fired jawbreakers, poom, 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 in quick succession, at the mice, many of whom were laid now. But the mice advanced irresistibly and overran some of the artillery positions. Such was the confusion, and such were the smoke and dust, that Marie could hardly see what was going on. But this much was certain: both sides fought with grim determination, and for a long while victory hung in the balance. The mice brought up more and more troops, and the little silver pills that they hurled powerfully and accurately with their slingshots penetrated even to the front glass-fronted cabinet. Clara and Trude ran about in despair, wringing their hands until they were sore. "Shall I, the most beautiful of dolls," cried Clara, "die in the bloom of my youth? Was it to perish within these four walls," sighed Trude, "that I have preserved my youthful bloom down through the years?" Then they fell on each other's necks and cried so loud that they could be heard above the din of the battle. For, dear listener, you can have no idea of the hubbub that now broke loose. Biff, boom, clatter, bang went the guns and muskets, and through it all the king of the mice and his hench mice squeaked and screamed. Nutcracker's mighty voice could be heard shouting useful orders, while he himself could be seen striding among his battalions in the thick of the fire. Pantaloon had led several brilliant cavalry charges and covered himself with glory, but Fritz's hussars were bombarded by the mouse artillery with nasty, foul-smelling pellets that made horrid spots on their little red jackets. After that, they lost all desire to advance. "Column left, march!" cried Pantaloon. In the enthusiasm of giving orders, he too wheeled about to the left, and so did his cuirassiers and dragons. In other words, they all column left marched and went home. This exposed the battery on the footstool, and it wasn't long before a large body of very ugly mice attacked so ferociously that the whole footstool, guns, gunners, and all, toppled over. In concertation, Nutcracker ordered his right wing to fall back. An experienced soldier like you, Fritz, know that falling back is pretty much the same as running away, and I'm sure you feel as bad as I do about the misfortunes of Marie's beloved Nutcracker and his army. But avert your eyes from this sorry situation and turn to the left wing of Nutcracker's army, where things are still going well, and there is still ground for hope. In the heat of the battle, masses of mouse cavalry had been quietly emerging from under the chest of drawers, and had flung themselves with blood-curdling squeaks on the left wing of Nutcracker's army. But what resistance they encountered! Slowly, because of the difficult terrain, the ledge of the glass-fronted cabinet had to be negotiated. The banner regiment, led by 2 Chinese emperors, had advanced and formed a square. These intrepid and magnificently uniformed troops, consisting of gardeners, triolines, tungusses, barbers, harlequins, cupids, lions, tigers, and monkeys, fought with coolness, courage, and perseverance. With their Spartan bravery, this elite regiment would have wrested the victory from the enemy, had not a daring mouse captain leaped into the fray and bitten the head off one of the Chinese emperors, who in falling crushed 2 tungusses and a monkey. This created a gap through which the enemy advanced, and soon the whole banner regiment was bitten to pieces. But the enemy gained little by their fiendish cruelty, for every time a mouse cavalryman murderously bit one of his valiant adversaries through the middle, a printed label stuck in his throat, and he died on the spot. This was of little help to Nutcracker's army, which, having once begun to fall back, retreated farther and farther with greater and greater losses, until the unfortunate Nutcracker himself found himself hard against the toy cabinet with a handful of followers. "Bring up the reserves," he cried. "Pantaloons, Scaramucci, drummers, where are you?" He was still hoping for fresh troops from the cabinet. And true enough, a few brown men with gold faces, hats, and helmets came out, but they wielded their swords so clumsily that, far from hitting any of the enemy, they knocked off General Nutcracker's cap. It wasn't long before the enemy Chaucers had bitten their legs off, and in toppling over, they killed a number of Nutcracker's men. Hemmed in on all sides, Nutcracker was in dire peril. He tried to jump over the ledge of the toy cabinet, but his legs were too short. Clara and Trude were lying in faint and could not help him. Hussars and dragons leapt nimbly past him into the cabinet. In wild despair, he shouted, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At that moment, 2 enemy musketeers seized him by his wooden cloak, and squeaking triumphantly from his 7 throats, the king of the mice charged him. Maria was beside herself. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker," she sobbed. Without quite knowing what she was doing, she took off her left shoe and flung it with all her might into the thick of the enemy, hoping to hit their king. At that moment, everything vanished from Marie's sight. She felt a sharp pain in her left arm and fell to the floor in a faint.
Is that the end of the chapter?
Yep.
Okay, everybody write down left shoe.